Silence. All right, we are live. Thanks everyone for joining us today. What we have is going to be a fun discussion with three non-lawyers about a very interesting legal topic, open source licensing. We're going to start out with what open source licenses are, why they're important, why you need them at all, why engineers are mucking around with legal things. And then we're going to get into the business side of it, why licenses matter for business, how investors look at open source, how they look at open source licensing, how you convert GitHub stars into valuation, all of those other fun topics, and especially how all of this is changing now, both with software and with AI, where we're trying to reuse the same licenses in different contexts. So let's start with introductions. I have a couple awesome guests for this today. We have Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey everyone, Chris Aniszczyk, CTO of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is host at the Linux Foundation, and kind of been involved in open source for, oh gosh, I don't know, say this 20, 25 years, depending how far you want to go back, from early days Linux kind of contributor to even startup founder back in the day before open source startups were popular, to now kind of enjoying the fun life of building and scaling one of the largest open source foundations out there.
Awesome. And then we also have Renee. Do you want to introduce yourself, Renee?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. I'm Renee Shaw. I'm one of the partners at Amplify Partners. We're an early stage venture capital fund. We really only focus on three core spaces: infrastructure, dev tools, and security. And so about half of our investments are open source. So it's a go-to-market motion we understand really, really well, and looking forward to chatting more and giving some hot takes.
Yeah, perfect. All right, so we're going to start out with you, Chris. I remember, I've known you for a very long time. I don't know how long, but I do remember when I dug through my inbox for emails from you, the very, very first one I had in there was you relicensing Twitter Bootstrap.
Yeah.
Related to that. So it was way before we knew each other. But let's jump in there. Like, what are open source licenses? Why do we need them? Why might someone consider using one versus the other? Why might we change them? Let's start out with the basics.
Yeah, we could do with the basics. So I mean, open source licenses are simply software licenses that allow, basically describe how the software you produce is shared, reused, mixed, whatever kind of permissions you have on it. Because basically, I think it was in the 80s when all this wonderful stuff started, where software was basically treated as kind of like a literary work under standard copyright law. It's when the whole it's called free software and kind of open source movement started, and the whole idea was hey, we need an alternative to traditional proprietary software, and there needs to be maybe some standardized terms that we could all understand what we could do with this software, right? So we had the rise of the GPL movement, Linux got popular, and then almost, let's call it 30, 40 years past, and we have a variety of different open source licenses out there. We have an organization called the Open Source Initiative, which kind of maintains a basic, let's call it, set of standards of what open source actually means, and kind of a list of blessed definitions. And I think for some of those folks who maybe are a little bit younger or don't have kind of that early history, back in the day, it was a huge pain in the ass to actually go use open source software in any company. There was no kind of standards really out there. Companies were very kind of dismissive of it. You had crazy internal approval and procurement processes that you have to go to. Once all this stuff kind of got standardized is what really allowed things to kind of bloom, right? Companies had a very, very solid understanding of, oh, this is what a standard open source license is. It's an Apache thing, it's an MIT thing. So that whole standardization really kind of greased the wheels of adoption, and that's kind of what we've seen now, depending when you look at, research from GitHub or, pick your random SCA company, it's like most of the world is running 80, 90% open source software in the proprietary. So hopefully that's like a quick, synopsis, but open source licenses basically dictate the terms that you could use, the software, whether things be remixed or not. And, maybe analogous things for people that are maybe not familiar with it is, you ever use like things like Flickr or things like that? There's like Creative Commons is kind of a very common thing of, here are the terms what you could do with my photos, right? Same type of ideas apply to software.
So if I'm just going to put software up on GitHub, why do I have to pick a license? Why can't I just put it there?
By default, any piece of software that is shared on GitHub without a license kind of falls under like an all rights reserved, thing based on like the Berne Convention and how copyright law works across the world. So that basically means it's there, it's quote unquote open, but there's no essential permissions associated with that. Whoever contributed or owned the copyright that dictates all the terms there, right? So if you see a license like an MIT license or Apache license there, then it generally covers that project. But by default, it's all rights reserved. And funny enough, we kind of got in a weird situation when in the early days of GitHub. GitHub did not recommend a set of licenses by default when you created projects. So we ended up in a weird world where lots of these projects were created without licenses, and then you kind of had to I'm sure you've experienced this, like, hey, we like this software, can you please add a license to it? Dynamic that we probably went through 5-10 years ago quite frequently. But now GitHub luckily allows here's a license box, please choose one.
Yeah, there's one other angle to it too that I remember getting hammered home to me in open source training at Google when I was there. There's you can't use stuff without a license. Obviously, there was this nice polite way to ask for one if you wanted to try. The other angle though is if you were going to publish stuff, you had to make very sure to put a license up, and that was for the defensive angle of it. Right? If you read a lot of these licenses, the very first paragraph says, if you use this and it breaks, you also can't sue us. And so there's kind of like the other angle, both around what you can use but protecting yourself.
Yeah, no warranties included. Right. Sometimes there's also a lot of people don't realize there's a huge, patent, thing associated with open source software, right? That, I don't know if we have time to kind of dive in on, patent grants and patent retaliation clauses that exist in such as the Apache license, but there's a reason like companies like Google and mature organizations prefer open source license like Apache that have that kind of patent retaliation, clause associated with it.
Cool. Yeah, so everybody puts in these licenses, they're safe on lawsuits, people are safe to use them and all of that. You're giving away code, anyone can use that code for free. How does somebody build a company on this, Renee? If everyone's just giving this stuff away, like how do you charge for it? Like why would you be a venture capitalist investing in this if everything's kind of this free hippie commune, free love world?
Yeah, I mean, open source I think is one of the best distribution strategies out there. Like you can build a big community really fast. You get a ton of developers to get to try your product. And let's be honest, developers at these days don't really want to use software that they can't try and see. So the pendulum has just swung where like it's really hard to invest in a database, for example, that's not open source. I think that companies need to be really clear about their strategy because open source software isn't the product itself. So you need some sort of product around it. You need open core where you do things like monitoring, security, reporting, et cetera, around your product, and you go charge for that, collab features, or you just do SaaS hosting. And that's typically works for more like complex distributed system stuff. But I think where companies get in trouble is that they don't really have a clear product strategy around the open source. So they're like, oh, well, a lot of people pick this up and we have a ton of GitHub stars, but maybe it's a compiler, a linter, or something that folks just don't really pay for. So the product strategy is really key. And that's what we look for from an investment point of view. So it's like, okay, you get a great amount of lead gen, which we love. And then what's the product strategy that we can actually go invest in? And so it's the difference between creating value, which open source does, versus capturing value, which only some companies have done and then others have failed.
Yeah, there's this episode of South Park with the underpants gnomes. Do you know this? It's this great thing where there's these gnomes that go around stealing underwear, and it's a step one in their business plan is steal underwear. Step two is question mark, question mark, question mark. Step three is profit. So you're saying people need to fill in that step two, and you can't just get GitHub stars then profit.
You can't. And I feel like and some of this is, I think, as there's been more VC funding chasing open source. A lot of these projects have gotten funded, which just have a ton of GitHub stars. But those projects maybe haven't been sustainable over time. And so I think there's been this retraction, and this is why people maybe are closing some of the licenses and potentially venture dollars will flow away because I think money hasn't always gone to sustainable businesses. And I don't know if this is true, maybe you guys know, but I think there are ways now you can just get stars on your project. Like they're literally star farms. I don't think they're talked about that much. But Chris, is this true? We've heard this through the grapevine.
For sure. There's definitely ways to buy fake GitHub stars, like that you could buy fake Instagram followers. And whether companies have done this or not, I'm not going to disclose any funny stories, but I've definitely witnessed competing projects complaining about their competitor buying fake GitHub stars.
Yeah.
And there are actually some tools out there. I think if you Google Stargaze, people have written tools to try to like detect fake GitHub stars.
Yeah, totally. But I will add, there are better metrics that we use to evaluate these projects outside of stars. Like I think forks, issues where you can really see what people are talking about, pull requests, contributors, and then just members in a Discord or Slack channel, and you can actually look at the real engagement of the community. So stars might not be the best metric, but there are other open source metrics that we really like.
I think it's good you touched on the sustainability topic and coming up with what that strategy is up front, because I think there's this perception now that we've seen, especially as kind of the funding markets have dried up, that the strategy is get a bunch of GitHub stars with the cool, free, easy license, and then change the license later and kind of rug pull, and that's how you make money. So are you telling me, Renee, that is not what you advise everyone to do in your secret VC meetings?
Yeah.
This massive movement to kill open source?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely not. And in fact, I am not so worried about the cloud providers running software. I mean, it really depends on your goal. But from my point of view, if you are on Amazon's radar and they want to run your open source software, I mean, you've already won. That is likely a $1 billion business. I'm pretty happy with that. Other folks are happy with that. We've seen it more with public companies, and then you have shareholders and you have growth rates. So I think that's kind of actually a different game than what most seed stage startup founders are trying to do. I will also say that with a very crisp product strategy, like I love to use the example of Databricks. I mean, I think they're one of the most innovative companies out there right now. They have their data lake product. They've done a ton of stuff with LLMs. I mean, they started on Spark, and they never had to do like a bait and switch, as far as I know, because they kept expanding their product line from there. It's not equally easy for every business because not every piece of open source software is created equal. And I know that for HashiCorp, and just using that one because it's the most prominent, Vault and Terraform are 85% of their revenues in their 10K last year. And I think they're doing great with Vault. It's a really hard system to run. It's hard to build. They host it for you. If you need replication, that's a hard problem. I think they got into trouble with Terraform because, like, how do you monetize a config language, essentially? And they tried, and then there were, a bunch of startups that were saying, okay, well, instead of using Terraform Cloud, you can use Terraform and Pulumi. So they kind of built the same product, but across a bunch of, different configuration tools. And that's kind of what upset Hashi. But I think the core issue was the product strategy around Terraform may not have been clear from the start. And then they ended up in a position where they were sort of struggling. And then they tried with and also they have Nomad, they have Console, they have all these other products, but they also aren't revenue drivers. And so I think that is a part of their strategy that I think they have to figure out and could drive growth of the business. It just hasn't done it yet.
I just want to comment on your discussion regarding Amazon and kind of people's fear of, AWS. There was a meme going around oh my gosh, any open source project, AWS is going to take it and just monetize and make money. I'm like, I look at, there's Mongo, there's Elastic, there's a lot of these kind of public multi-billion-dollar companies that are doing just completely, fine. And you even look at Elastic, AWS has invested in OpenSearch, which is basically a fork competitor, and they're still doing fine. The market and TAM for these things is probably larger, I think, than people realize. And to your point of AWS helping grow that market, I think is a thing. I just there's very few examples where I could say a cloud has killed an open source, company, right? Maybe impact revenue a little bit, but hasn't, that's fine. That's just the nature of business.
Yeah, and to give some historical and timeline context there, I think we started to see, and you probably know more than I do on this, Chris, but we started to see these new licensings and these new licenses come out in the area of Mongo and Elastic and some of these other database companies where they got really popular on these permissive licenses. And there was a worry, 6 or 7 years ago, that Amazon or the other cloud providers would just SaaSify your product, outcompete you with economies of scale, and then steal your customers. And so was the SSPL first? Which one was first when kind of look at these more restrictive licenses?
I think that was one of the early ones. There's SSPL, there's Fair Source License. There was a variety of these things that kind of popped up, and even Business Source. You could go back to further back to the database days, too. So but I don't think I don't think it's ever come to fruition that these these large, evil cloud providers have destroyed open source companies. I think they just really helped grow the market and kind of maybe serve their existing things. And at the end of the day, people are always going to pay for, I think, a superior product, and maybe the open source progenitors of Mongo or these other projects are able to build a better product and developer experience, which I think will always attract folks. And at the end of the day, sometimes you could actually just go run these things on cloud, right? Like you could just go run their SaaS-based things on cloud things, and everyone wins at the end of the day.
Totally.
Yeah. So jumping back to like the open source licenses in general, you said there's a couple different kinds of them.
Yep.
Like, they have these core freedoms and there's a bunch of philosophy in them. But,
Yep.
Anyone has to be able to use them for anything. And then these new licenses kind of came out, which try to restrict that in some ways of like, well, you're allowed to use them for anything as long as it doesn't compete with us, or you're allowed to use them for anything except for this one specific.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's the open source definition, which no one really knows about outside of like, maybe if you've gone through open source training at your company, it's like, oh, here's the OSD. And, there's like, I think there's 2 handfuls of kind of terms of what exists in the OSD. And a lot of them are, or 2 of them that are kind of important regarding what you're talking about, or like no discrimination against like fields of endeavor, right, is one of them, right? And that's like, you can't like, your open source license can't dictate that your competitor can't use this. Then it's no longer open source, or you can't discriminate against selling to the military or certain types of groups or companies. Otherwise, it's not open source.
Mm-hmm. So these new ones kind of come out and try to narrowly change that, where they argue that it's mostly open source unless you're doing one of these small things.
Yeah.
And I really like what you said in the beginning about companies finally getting comfortable with, and we can come back to this Copilot one in a second. Companies finally getting comfortable using these open source licenses, greasing the wheels and making it easy to use things. That works because it took 20 years for people to read these licenses and really understand them. And now as soon as you put in this small gotcha, we're right back to where we were with friction and lawyers reviewing everything.
Yeah, and it's a painful time for folks that experience that in industry. It was terrible. It just made your life harder because you would just go reinvent stuff instead of using open source stuff. So now it's everyone. We're in a plethora of riches problem where there's like literally so many freaking key value stores, libraries. That there's just too many options in some ways. But that's good. That's kind of what we've created.
Yeah, perfect. So this is a good one from Dan here. I want to touch on this a little bit more, the role of foundations, and then we can get on to some of the fun changes with AI and that's also ruining open source. Chris, you work at the Linux Foundation. You host a ton of open source projects. You've been accused of ruining open source recently in the news for hosting too many open source projects. What do you see the role of a foundation for, and how does this? Is it necessary? Are single vendor open source projects okay too? What do you see here?
No, I think single vendor, projects are completely fine. There's nothing kind of wrong with them as long as the terms are very kind of clear of what you expect from like a single vendor. I think GitLab does a great job with they kind of have this like stewardship principles of like what their attitude is towards the open source bits. Of GitLab and how features potentially get rolled into the enterprise product. I think just being transparent, single vendor, completely fine. What I think has happened recently is due to some of the quote unquote rug pulling that's happening, it's kind of woken up some companies out there that, oh, wait a minute, if we are depending on something that's from a single vendor, can they like HashiCorp us and just like overnight change the license and demand money? So I think being single vendor open source is like a risk factor, and every company is going to be a little bit different on that. Sometimes they're like, great, we have someone to pay, and others like maybe we'll evaluate other options there. To your point about open source foundations, I think open source foundations at the end of the day are all about a neutral IP holding ground for open source software, that the ownership is distributed across the members, so there's a fair level playing field. You kind of de-risk open source. If that single vendor just failed, who knows what will happen to the code? It could disappear. It could end up in some kind of weird, M&A fire sale situation. Who knows, right? So foundations, I think, truly help kind of, de-risk open source. And, obviously, you have some experience with Linux Foundation too. Like we do a lot more. We help with security audit. There's just a lot of stuff that foundations
logos, flag.
Yeah. logos. So, I mean, you get all the like community building things that are always not the easiest thing. Events, obviously we have KubeCon coming up in a couple months, and there's a lot of stuff that we can kind of do. But I think we truly de-risk, open source software. And not all foundations are alike. There's a lot of different ones out there that may have different rules. So you kind of have to, be a little bit, careful and evaluate. But like the big standard ones, Linux Foundation, Apache Foundation, they're all very, very similar. I'd be more suspicious if a company set up their own foundation for shits and giggles, which I have a couple examples. They're a little bit different. So
yeah, I think this is probably an area where you might not disagree.
Yeah.
But this might be an area where you're probably not
Yeah.
quite in line.
Yeah.
Because, foundations de-risk it for adoption, but for does it make it harder for companies to monetize?
Yeah, the tricky part with the foundation is that sometimes when the projects get donated to the foundation, and Chris, you can tell if this is right or not, but you have the perception that the main authors lose a little bit of control and they're not like quite as attached to the project. And one of the biggest drivers of open source for us is the main author, namely being the CEO of the company, and the main author being the steward of the open source, because so much of that community growth is that person like evangelizing the community and being larger than life and being loved by developers. And I think that some of that is slightly diluted when they're in a foundation. So that's the thing we want to be careful of. But I'm curious, Chris, if you think this happens in real life. This is like our perception from the outside.
So for me, like I think the only control you generally lose is, I don't see necessarily like a governance thing where, if you have a, BDFL, a benevolent dictator for life or original author situation, they generally still do a lot of control, but you may have you may outline the rules of what it means to like do a release. How do you add or remove maintainers? Like key things that I think are critical to building like large scalable communities. You do lose control. Generally, most foundations will require the trademark of the project to be neutrally owned and managed by the foundation, which is fair if you're in a multiple vendor situation, because you kind of want to have the same rules. Like Kubernetes, for example, there's up teen vendors that have Kubernetes engines products, and they all have the same fair trademark rules. Google doesn't have any special exceptions there. But I do think from a business perspective, there is a fundamental difference between a project and a product, right? Not every open source project, I think, could be turned into a monetizable product at the end of the day. Sometimes it works. It's just like startups. Some startups work, some don't, right? And I think, I don't know if it was Martin Mikos who had this original saying, but, there's a saying where if you have an open source project, generally the people that are using your project, a lot of those people have time, but not necessarily money to pay to buy like a product, right? And on the product side, the community that you're wanting to be selling the stuff to, those are the folks that, have money, but maybe not time, so they're willing to pay. And I think the fundamental difference is how do you treat those things differently? Because I do think they are different, and names generally have inherent value proposition with them. So I always try to tell people try to name your project different from your product, because if you're going to sell to that same community, it's a nightmare. Like your sales team is going to, I think, murder you, because they're competing essentially with the open source projects.
Totally. And we also, just on that point, really want to build projects, but we're big believers in trademarking. Like you should also trademark the name. Someone can fork your project, but you own the trademark stuff.
Absolutely.
So we're anti protection. It's just about keeping the community open.
Yeah, I was going to get into that of should you name the project and the company the same thing? And one of the things that you can give up with open source foundations is that trademark, and I actually can't think of many successful startups that did have their code owned by a foundation. That had the same name and tried to go through that way. There's got to be an example.
Red Hat.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of. Docker was a little bit weird, where the company, the project, and the product were all the same name. Yeah. But Docker's fairly successful now. Yeah. They've pulled out a great business model.
But yeah, that wouldn't have been something they could put into a foundation because of that trademark.
Yeah.
There's one.
Funny enough, a lot of the stuff that Docker is built on, by the way, is in a foundation. This, right? A lot of the core stuff that they've contributed is standardized.
Yeah, I think that ties really well into that product versus project distinction. A product is something people are willing to pay for. That can be comprised of a bunch of open source projects, but it's always a little bit different. And I think that probably ties into Dirk's question here a little bit. But a company that's done an amazing job explaining this distinction on their website and what their strategy is, the System Initiative. If you haven't seen this, they do a great job just breaking down what is the product, what is the project, what you can pay for, what you get for free, what you can use, what you can't use. And how that affects users of that code. And the trademark issue comes up all over the place when you have tools that are named the same name that is trademarked and everything. I mean, we see that a little bit with Kubernetes, but the other way, designed to make it neutral and designed to make it community versus designed to make it something owned by a single vendor.
Yeah.
So what is your strategy? Like, what is your strategy to companies that are looking to, raise a bunch of money and do something like that? Don't give it to Chris. Don't hand it to the CNCF.
Sorry, I kind of missed the question, Dan. You're saying what's the strategy?
What do you advise somebody that's founding a company in this space that wants to open source? What do you tell them to do? What's your default playbook?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, it's really nailing the product strategy, I think, early on, so you don't end up in a position where this bait and switch. And in fact, there have been a couple new startups that have done the BSL license from the start. They're all in the database, data infra space. I think that sector has done more closed licenses simply because it's harder to build a product strategy around that type of product. And, I tell those founders, I'm like, look, it's going to be harder to build a community, but you're not, and on Hacker News, everyone's upset about it, but at least you're not baiting and switching and you're being really clear from the start. So it is a way to run a business. I don't want to say that like no one can be successful doing like BSL or something from the start. But personally, I prefer, open licenses, but I think the open source itself has to be like a real product. So we invested in, for example, an open source project out of Uber called Cadence. It's now temporal. It's a durable execution platform. I mean, that's like a really robust piece of infrastructure, right? It prevents downtimes. You build workflows. Very different than like a flimsier piece of infrastructure. Like I think even front end frameworks, we were talking about JavaScript frameworks, like there are a ton, right, of JavaScript frameworks that commercialized and like Vercel, et cetera, they did great, but they all built cloud services to commercialize, and which is very different from commercializing a front end framework. Like it's very hard to do that on its own. I mean, you can add collab features and whatever, but it really isn't a business that people are going to pay for. So I think we really look for kind of just the robustness of the infrastructure, which just means how hard was it to build? How sticky is it when you in the enterprise? How defensible is it? Can a lot of other people build it? How many substitutes are there?
Looks like Renee sort of froze there.
Did I froze for a second? I was going to say, we really like open source projects that are like n=1, which means that there just aren't a lot of substitutes in the market. I think like Dan, just to shout you out, like SigStore and ChainGuard, like there weren't a lot of alternatives in the market. Whereas again, not to like poke at the JavaScript framework space, but they're always, 5 to 10.
There's a new one each day.
There's a new one each day, and it's really hard to create a monopoly there. So.
I have what's your, and I'm kind of curious of like, we're familiar with kind of like, frameworks, libraries, whether front end, back end. There's kind of been this funny thing in the news lately. I saw, I'm sure you saw the whole like Carta, stuff, and they're like, we need an open source version, of this kind of immediately. And like, I'm kind of curious whether, you'll see existing stable products out there like a Carta, maybe a Calendly, I don't know, a HubSpot, and hey, maybe there's an open source alternative there because they've already proven that a market exists for said, things. So I'm kind of curious if any viewpoint on that outside the whole Carta thing just being hilarious, where everyone's like, there's like 15, cap table open source management systems out there now. So.
Totally. I think that, this space is interesting because a lot of SaaS companies, or what you're really pointing out is SaaS going open source.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Proprietary SaaS companies that are now getting competition. So
totally. And I think there's totally a market for that distribution. You help people run it on-prem, you get all the security features and, a bunch of things companies want. I think the only thing where it doesn't always line up is that SaaS buyers and users just don't care about open source the way that devs care about it. So I think it's totally a business. I don't find it quite as necessary for SaaS companies to be open source, like even product analytics or something like linear issue tracking, that user is just very different. But I certainly have seen all, like, Slack, but open source, et cetera. Like, I think those are all great and, certainly could be great businesses.
Yeah. Okay. So you're talking about 1 million frameworks in JavaScript. Let's get to the other one where there's 1 million frameworks and a new one each day. AI. And so like there's a couple interesting implications and ways AI is changing licensing and ways licensing is changing with AI. One is the whole copyright trademark issue of like training. Is it fair? Is it cool to train AI on copyrighted open source code and then spit it out into a professional project and kind of regurgitate licenses and launder stuff through kind of these models? The other one though is like all of these kind of, again, open source light licenses where they're kind of open source and everyone gets confused and folks on Twitter hop in to remind everyone every single time someone calls Llama open source that it's not open source because it restricts competitors. Yes. But then there's these more ethical ones that are trying to restrict it to make sure that the AI isn't used for harmful use cases and things like this. Like, do you see a need for new license types for AI, or do you think the existing open source ones are fine and it's just the revival of people pretending they need it for business use cases?
From my perspective, I believe that we do need, it may not need like new full-blown licenses, but definitely maybe a definition of like, hey, if I'm using a piece of AI technology, is it fully open source? Do I have the weights associated to use to kind of build, the model? Do I actually, can I build this stuff from scratch myself? And this is not a uncommon thing because like this kind of exists in normal open source land. Like let's take like Red Hat Linux, for example, right? Like, yes, it's GPL, but sometimes, when they release the patches, is it one, big freaking, patch dump versus like individual disks for all the stuff they do? And like, I think there's like variation of like that spirit of open source versus like the actual maybe implementation for AI. I think it's going to have to include, the weights, how all this stuff is built and so on, not just, and obviously no restrictions. Like I think the reason open source has been extremely successful is the whole no restrictions on fields of endeavor and usage. Companies are just able to adopt this quickly. AI, I think, is doing well on like, consumer adoption. Am I freaking paying, money for ChatGPT so I could generate random stuff and, question why I have a PR and marketing team sometimes? Yes, right? But the enterprise side, I think is they're still trying to figure that out at the end of the day. But I do think there has to be some kind of crisp, like what truly is unencumbered, freely available, open source AI that there is an illegal risk, and then there's many, ways to quantify.
Do you see more trends, Renee, in this space? Because I'm sure you're chasing a bunch of AI startups now, like everyone else. Like, do you see more trends of people there doing these open source light licenses where it's not fully open?
Oh, totally. We're seeing like a ton of people doing that. But then the other issue is that just training on open source code bases, for example, for some of these code gens are creating new problems. Like we're seeing a ton more code vulnerabilities now, or, you're training on bad data. And so then the code that's produced is incorrect. So it's kind of creating a new category of startups now where we're, trying to do, more in terms of like code testing. Can you verify AI generated code? Is it correct? Does it have security vulnerabilities? So it's funny. It's like you get these dev productivity tools, but then it almost creates like a new market and a new class of startups.
So we shouldn't be worried about our jobs just yet.
I mean, yeah, we shouldn't be too worried. I think especially for, like very, very, I would say most of like the best engineers I know are not using these coding tools, but.
Yeah, I think I'm seeing a greater willingness to use these models that aren't under, actually fully permissible licenses than I think we would in say infra code. Right. But I think that's going to cause problems later, like you're talking about, Chris, because they're not fully unencumbered, but people are using them anyway.
Yeah, and like if you look at it, like Google, Microsoft, they all kind of done these crazy, like, let's call it guarantees, right? Where like, hey, you use this and we'll protect you from any, lawsuits associated with using a model. That's just, when you're $1 trillion company, it's pretty easy to do something like that. But these things are going to get litigated for a while. Like you saw the New York Times thing came up, and there's, I think, all sorts of questions we have to kind of answer from our software kind of traditional open source community when if you're going to have a bunch of stuff that's been trained on code under a variety of different licenses, right? If you regurgitate something that came from the Linux kernel, obviously that's, technically should be, GPL. Then are you going to intermingle GPL in a code base where that was not your intention? I think there's a lot of stuff to kind of, iron out, here of like how these models have been trained on what, kind of understand the lineage of these things, and just kind of like it's kind of like a testing a software supply chain, Dan, which I'm sure you're intimately familiar with.
But yeah, and data doesn't have anywhere near as close to as good in structured licensing as software does today. We don't have SPDX tags on every data element on every tweet that you're grabbing and training on, so it's a little bit different.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the industry will mature. Like they will, like some people will demand it and so on. So, and, everyone's gonna, have fun, suing each other for a while. Cause, you just kind of think about it. Like, oh, you generate, use Dolly and you generate something that looks like, Mickey Mouse or Goofy or something. You're like, wait a minute. Like, how is that,
how's that okay?
Yeah. How is that okay for maybe the copyright holder?
Yeah.
Stuff like that.
Yeah, most of the license restrictions you see are based on that. I think like the Llama one says you're allowed to use it unless you have a chat service with over 200 million users or something like that, which is like targeted exactly like a very small handful of companies, and so you probably don't have to worry about it. But there's that other class too where they're kind of research only, and people are more worried about harm use cases. Personally, I'm a lot more sympathetic to those because it makes sense. It's like an ethical thing, but it is still a field of use restriction in some ways.
Yeah, and we've had that happen in normal, like when I say normal open source software, we had the whole ethical source license movement that kind of went nowhere because it, I trust me, very admirable about what they're trying to do, but at the end of the day, like business requires, very well trodden rules, transparency, just ease of use, right? And that's why people adopt open source software. If you have this cannot be used in a weapon or discriminate against, like it's just. Like it's mucking two different types of things in my opinion. So
fun times.
Yep.
For the output one, I think that's something we're seeing come up a lot more lately. Of the output of an LLM can't be copyrighted, right? Is my understanding. And so like you see songs that people are making now.
Currently.
Okay. Are you hinting at something?
Who knows? Yeah. No. It may like there's going to be a lot of litigation, and I think to iron out what exactly is there. But currently, that's the understanding, right? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Potentially more government standards too on just how to like laws governing this, and then probably a new class of startups that actually like help companies understand the laws and help them implement it. Sort of like a Banta SOC 2 type thing, but for AI in particular.
Yeah.
Definitely think that could
There's
be
money in regulation for sure.
Yeah. Dan knows that well too.
How's your FedRAMP status going?
Yeah, I use ChatGPT to fill out all those forms. That's great.
Oh yeah, did you?
Good.
That you could turn into a serious business.
Yeah, probably. Cool. All right. Well, I think we covered everything. We covered licenses, strategies, all of that stuff. Anything else you want to add before we wrap up, either of you?
I think I'll just end with like, I think this whole rug pulling, thing with, companies changing licenses, like somewhat overblown. Like there's like of all the open source software, of all the open source companies we have there, it hasn't happened that much. It's been maybe 2 handfuls of cases that I like literally came across. So it's still a very, minor thing that's actually happening, but it has woken up companies that single vendor open source may be a little bit risky, like for large end users enterprises that don't want to be caught by surprise at the end. But it's not like an industry trend by any means at all.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. Like, I think the pendulum on these things tends to swing back and forth. Like, people thought you couldn't make money on open source, then you can, and now people are switching back. But what I will say to folks building in this space is that competition is inevitable. Like, if you build a great product, it doesn't matter if it's open source or not, like you are going to have competition. And having if you do bait and switch and change the license, I understand you potentially could capture more value, but then somebody's going to go and fork your project. We've probably seen that anyways, with Elastic, with Terraform. And so then you fragment the community. And I don't actually think that's a very good outcome for you or your users or your overall growth engine. And I think one of the things with these license changes is we just haven't seen how they've worked over time. They've all been fairly new, like the last 5-ish years.
Yeah.
And so we just haven't seen like, okay, after companies change licenses, do they continue to grow for the next 15 years? We don't have the counterfactual yet. And so I'm very curious, like to see what HashiCorp's story is in 10 years. What's the stock price? Did it become Salesforce or like a $60 billion company, or did it stagnate? So I wouldn't assume that this is the right off the bat.
Yeah, I think I'd kind of jump on this.
Go ahead.
Or the trend here is not because open source is over. Somebody said like, are we in a post open source world now when you see the relicensing? No, open source is healthier than ever, and because there's so much more of it, you'd expect to see more of these relicensings. If we see less of them, then it would mean I'd be worried about open source, because it means there's less of it going on and fewer companies building on it. It's like the base rate fallacy, I guess. So yeah, I'm not worried about open source. Open source is great. It's going to outlast all of us. The AI bots that are running the world years from now are going to be making their own open source. We're going to be long gone.
Hopefully under OSD approved licenses and not coming up with their own bustle. I mean, you could probably come up with some good licenses using AI tools these days.
And then the open
software that can only be used by other AI. No, this would be great. It could be software only used by other AI bots, not humans, right? Let's just get that, discrimination.
That's perfect. Yeah. And then the AI bot lawyers can do all the license review.
Perfect. Yeah, it'd be a great role. But yeah, it's truly a plethora of riches problem. Like there's so much options and choice out there for companies. I almost kind of feel bad where, you have Optine databases, Optine key value stores, Optine library. It's a very difficult, but it's a good problem. Like, this is a huge embodiment of knowledge that we've all kind of, built and shared that's improving, I think, the world and the stuff that we kind of deliver as humans.
All right. Well, thanks all for your time today. I think this was a great one.
Yeah, this was great.
Well, let's keep ruining open source together.
And yeah, let's do it. And we'll catch up in a year. And I kind of want to bet on what happens to the whole HashiCorp Terraform thing. But we'll see. Maybe we'll do this in a year again.
Perfect.
Oh, there's a good question there. And like that just disappeared.
Are we still live? Maybe we can do this one. Yeah.
Not sure.
I was like, okay, Terraform, give me a sec. No, I mean, the whole Terraform open tofu thing, I just view it as, trying to monetize and own their whole ecosystem versus trying to kind of grow the pie and with other competitors and so on. I think we'll see what happens. They're not going away anytime soon, but never underestimate a community scorned, because they will work tirelessly to kind of mess with the company.
Yeah. I mean, I'm curious to see, like, it seems like OpenTofu has, a ton of people who are contributing the project and continuing to make updates. I think when these projects get forked in their two communities, it almost becomes like a battle of like, who's going to like update the software more, who's going to, keep it fresh and maintained and be forward looking. And it's just who's going to put more resources into it. Time will tell.
Yeah, it's like CentOS versus RHEL, and like I think the Linux community, especially if you like piss off that community, they kind of they'll go forever. I think there's a lot of maybe shared camaraderie with the Linux folks and the Terraform folks. So we'll see what happens long term. But hey, competition is good at the end of the day, because in theory it should help HashiCorp step up and produce better products that serve needs. So it's all good for end users.
And more stuff to fill up the CNCF landscape.
Yeah, we just released a new version of Landscape. You should check it out. It's live and fresh and searchable. You can even build your own landscapes now. We made that easier for you, Dan. So
my favorite thing. All right, well, we do have to wrap up now. So thanks, everyone. Appreciate all of your time, and have a great day.
Cool. Yeah. Take care, all.